Well, before we get into tonight's topic denotatively, let's stand back and ask ourselves a very fundamental question to put this in a broader context. What is your most important stewardship? Some would say the family, certainly more than finances. I'm going to suggest that your most important stewardship is the battle for your heart. That's really the issue, the larger issue that we're going to be dealing with. Paul warned his protege Timothy in his second letter. He says, "Know also that in the last days perilous times shall come. For men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of those that are good, traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasures more than the lovers of God, having a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof. From such turn away." Indeed, this is one of the fundamental signs that we are clearly moving into the last days. And there is a path to oblivion, I'll call it. And clearly it starts by being in a society that's committed to secularism. Clearly we live in a culture which maintains there really is no God. And from that conviction, or lack thereof, comes the view that there is no truth. We live in a time when truth is relative. You have your truth, I have mine kind of thing. And Alan Bloom highlighted the fact that if you don't believe in an absolute truth, that puts a total valuelessness to history. Then we wonder why in the universities our young people have no real interest in the great ideas of the past, because the quest for truth would be futile. There is no real truth. We each have our own. It's interesting, Isaiah warned us of this. People ask me, where is America in the Bible? And I say very clearly in Isaiah chapter 5, with the 6 woes. But the most typical one I'll highlight here, where Isaiah says, "Woe unto them that call evil good, and good evil, and put darkness for light and light for darkness, that put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe unto them that are wise in their own eyes, and prudent in their own sight." So clearly, value relativism is what we're facing. That turns out to lead to the materialism we all experience. If there is no truth, then we become self-absorbed. The most important thing in our lives is ourselves. We are in the me generation. You can go to the bookstands and find magazines to self, we, me, and so on. And this self-absorption, of course, is basically a form of materialism. He that has the most toys wins, or velocity makes any road seem right. The answer in our lives is to get more stuff. And clearly, materialism finds itself, sooner or later, bankrupt for lots of reasons. First of all, we'll discover even in the scientific realm, we find ourselves on very shaky foundations. And of course, also materialism leads to moral bankruptcy. So what we're facing here, all of us, is what actually is an epistemological challenge. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, its scope and limits. And we really are in a quest for understanding truth. Where do we get real knowledge? Furthermore, those of us that are biblically informed recognize that we also face this quest under conditions of a hostile adversary. An adversary whose primary weapons are deceit and disinformation. And so the study of knowledge, its scope and limits, is the broad thing. And the reason this is important to every one of us is Jesus Christ gave us a challenge, an imperative, a command. He said, "Be not deceived." He said that several times. Okay, great. How do we do that? What are our tools to prevent being deceived? So as we look at epistemology, and of course that's a very vacant study because it's generally taught in philosophy classes in universities, and it really becomes a massaging of definitions. But clearly most of the debate in epistemology had to do with does knowledge come from reason or from experience? And the rationalists, of course, committed themselves to deductive reasoning, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz being perhaps typical of the rationalists, but soon superseded by the empiricists, saying that tangible evidence is the key to it. Francis Bacon, John Locke, and others. And that, of course, led to the scientific method, the rise of modern science, and that's committed itself to empirical validation, that what we really know is what we can empirically, experimentally validate. Except it's interesting, as we look back now at the history of science, it has actually quite a list of dismal failures. There was a time when phlogiston was a theory of combustion. And of course, that was shredded by Lavoisier, the father of modern chemistry. Then we had this theory about ether between heavenly bodies that, of course, was shattered by the Michelson-Morley experiment. And then we had the nebular hypothesis that the planets came out of the sun. This is still taught in most astronomy classes. It was invented by Swedenborg. Swedenborg was an occultist, and he sold the idea to Laplace, who did not check the math, who endorsed it, and then Kant took it and popularized it, and it's still taught today, even though with any knowledge of orbital mechanics, it's easily shredded because you've got 98% of the mass in the sun, and you've got 98% of the angular momentum in the planets, and turns out when you try to reconcile that, there's no way the planets came out of the sun mathematically. The nebular hypothesis, again, lacks empirical validation. Then we get into the whole area of the paradoxical nature of light. J.J. Thomson got the Nobel Prize for proving that photons were a stream of particles in 1906. His son, in 1937, got the Nobel Prize for proving that that light was actually a wave phenomenon. And so the paradoxical nature of light continues. And then, of course, we had the Setterfield-Norman hypothesis that light is not a constant, but slowing down. That was laughed at by physicists for several decades, and now recently is being confirmed through experiments. So even empirical science has its failures. And so that leaves us with some still pending enigmas. Do you realize that most of what we know about matter comes from a small sample? Scientists know that there's matter. Most of the matter in the universe is not visible. It's dark. It doesn't give off light. And they're searching for it, dark matter. What's astonishing is dark matter, as they call it, constitutes about 95% of the matter in the universe. So what we know about neutrons, protons, and so forth comes actually from a small sample. Then we get into microbiology with DNA. And we discover that the DNA is edited. When you make an RNA copy, you edit parts of it out and take the parts you need to code up proteins. And the parts that are coded and left out, or extrons as they call them, are labeled in your textbooks as junk DNA. They assume it's just vestiges of a past evolutionary cycle or something. Well, now they discover that the junk DNA, as it's called in the textbooks, actually has value. It contains architectural information. But the shocking thing is, do you realize how much of the DNA is labeled junk DNA? Over 98%. So again, we could use some humility in these things. And then we get to particle physics, which absolutely pulls the rug out from under the foundations of science itself. Because we suddenly have the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, misapplied by many philosophers to other things, but basically it turns out certain things behave differently if they're being observed. And then we have the laws of causality. The idea of cause and effect, which is the primary handmaiden of science, is now shattered in the field of quantum physics. And then we discover that subatomic particles lack a property called locality, that all photons, it's been experimentally confirmed, apparently, that all photons know what all other photons in the universe are doing instantaneously. These concepts totally shatter the philosophical foundations. That's the reason why Boltzmann committed suicide, one of the early pioneers, because he recognized the philosophical implications of quantum physics. But as you grab this, then you suddenly discover the thing we call reality is actually a digital simulation, that our so-called reality is just virtual. So this is causing even philosophical foundations being shattered. So as we go through and we look at materialism, which has shaky material foundations and of course leads to moral bankruptcy, we experience that in our society. What is the next bridge to cross? Where do people go that have committed themselves to materialism and discover it's found wanting? And the answer is predictable, although surprising. And that is, we have the death of the soul. We have a lost generation, a generation without God, an emptiness of life that you see in all quarters, all pursuits. And guilty as part of this is the impact of the media, which presents perception rather than reality as the real pursuit reality. And this leads to desensitizing our emotions, and both individually and culturally, leading us to what some people would call an emptiness of the times, a spiritual vacuum which sets us up for the ultimate delusion, the spirit of the Antichrist, and So we're seeing this in rather apocalyptic terms. Well, so where do we go from materialism? We go to mysticism. People are asking, is there anybody out there? It's astonishing to find people in this age of rationalism flocking to various forms of mysticism. Pagan Babylonian mysticism that we have repackaged as the New Age, Christian Gnosticism, as exemplified by some of the novels and so forth that are popular today. But also, one of the strangest forms of this is Jewish mysticism in the form of the Kabbalah. And so when you talk about mysticism, by the way, it embraces a lot of related topics. Metaphysics, of course, is simply the basic nature or structure of being. And that, incidentally, in Russia is a subdivision of the field of physics, a little differently than we organize ourselves in this country. Cosmology, of course, is the study of the origin of the universe, and most mysticisms focus on this issue, among others. And they generally are regarded as theosophies, systems of conjectures into the divine nature. What is God really like? And so forth. And occultism is, of course, the study or control, attempt to control, supernatural powers. And theurgy is a very similar term, compelling or persuading supernatural powers. Many people's approach to prayer is really a theurgy. And of course, all of this is also embraces magic, both black as well as so-called white magic and so on. But mysticism is simply the attempt to try to establish direct contact to the divine. And it embraces all of these things in various ways. But the Kabbalah is the one that we're going to sort of focus on in these sessions, which has a number of elements. Esotericism is part of it, that there are secrets, truth, that are relegated to the inside group, only the elite, only those that are really on the inside can embrace the real truth. And of course, it also includes Gnosticism, Greek, Christian, and also mixed very much with, strangely enough, Muslim superstitions. And it obviously is primarily focused on theosophy, the nature of the divine nature. And what's strange about the Kabbalah is that there's this paradoxical convergence between intuition or conjectures on the one hand and tradition on the other. It's a strange mix of both. And so the earliest forms of this, of course, in the first centuries AD, were a variant on Hellenistic beliefs from Pythagoras and others. And the medieval Spanish Kabbalah, which is where it really flowered, was based on Neoplatonism and Gnosticism, and what a great preoccupation with language. Symbolic language in the sense of the alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet obviously specifically, and numbers. And the whole idea that the creation itself was a result of language, thoughts expressed that became the creation. So they really regard a very, very special relationship between reality and the way it's expressed in both letters and numbers. And so one of the things that's going on, and one reason we're pursuing some understanding of this area, is because of its strange popularity among celebrities. There are many articles being written about Madonna, Demi Moore, and many others here listed that have publicly identified themselves with a form of Kabbalah that is popular in Hollywood. And it's very strange that people with resources, people that have the opportunity to really find out the truth, are flocking to these forms of expression. And so our agenda in these two sessions will be to take a quick snapshot of the history of Judaism. We use that term very loosely, failing to really understand how it has changed through the years, how it has refocused itself. Mosaic Judaism has been redefined. Most of us think of Judaism as belief in the Old Testament, but it turns out that they went through a crisis and redefined it. And what we really mean by Judaism today is Talmudic Judaism and the era that followed its publication, so-called geonic era, and out of which emerged this strange form of mysticism called the Kabbalah. And And out of that came Hasidism. Most of us are familiar with the ultra-Orthodox in the Crown Heights district of Brooklyn and so forth that still cling to 18th century Eastern European cultural standards. But the Hasidism actually emerged out of the Kabbalah. And so we have a challenge here that's actually an epistemological challenge. And we want to understand, how does this fit in to what I'll call the path to oblivion? How do we prevent ourselves from being deceived by things that would seem to be very appealing? And what tools do we have to avoid being deceived? And so let's just jump in. We're hoping not to offend anyone. Our sources for the materials here lean very heavily on Gershom Scholem, who is acknowledged as one of the experts. He was a professor of Kabbalah at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem from 1923 through 1965, and his books are considered quite authoritative to those that are in the Kabbalah. Encyclopedia Judaica with 17 volumes has much to say on this, and of course so does Britannica and Carta and the other standard resources, and some of this has also been influenced by personal interviews, both in the Sefirot area in Israel, rabbis there, as well as here in the U.S., and so that's we'll give you the best perceptions we can. Mosaic Judaism, of course, as we might perceive it by studying the books of Moses and the Old Testament, had a crisis, of course, with the destruction of the temple in 70 A.D. The Jewish leadership had rejected Jesus Christ as the Messiah, and on the heels of that, just as Jesus predicted, the temple was destroyed in 70 A.D., a major national calamity. That led to the Council of Yamnia in 90 A.D., the Greek translation of the Jewish scriptures that had been done 3 centuries earlier had become really the Christian's Bible, and that caused much consternation in the Jewish community and led, in effect, to steps that ultimately developed the Masoretic text some centuries later. But from the Council of Yamnia and so forth, they're starting to redefine Judaism. They have a major problem in Judaism. Mosaic Judaism, it was built all around the notion that without the shedding of blood, there's no remission of sins. Well, suddenly they have no temple, no altar, and there's no place to shed blood. What do they do about sin? And this has caused a lot of debate and so forth, but the net of it is to redefine Judaism in terms of what we would call good works, to reconcile themselves with God by living exemplary lives and focusing on conduct and that sort of thing. And that led, of course, to the pulling together of the Talmud, Talmudic Judaism. And one of the things that characterizes Talmudic Judaism is the veneration of the great scholars that are involved, even above the text that they're expositing. And so we have, out of Talmudic Judaism will come the Kabbalah some centuries later, and Hasidism, and we'll go through that. But as we reflect on the 1st and 2nd century then, Judaism is going through a major redefinition and a crisis, and so is Christianity. This is the rise of the Gnostics, people who had all kinds of conjectures about the reality that were quite non-biblical. Many tried to reconcile those two, and Gnosticism also was esoteric, limited to the insiders and so forth. And many of the New Testament epistles were written to rebut Gnosticism, Colossians and others, and the epistles of John. And so by the time you get to the 3rd century following, we have the pulling together in the Jewish community of the Talmud. There are 2 Talmuds, the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud, both occurring from the 3rd through the 5th centuries. The Babylonian Talmud, interestingly enough, is regarded as the authoritative one because it's the academy that produced it there in Babylon survived the others by some years. So we have following that then the whole codification of Jewish civil and religious law, recognizing they were not limited to the written laws, the books of Moses, but they also incorporated what they call the oral tradition, laws that were handed down verbally. And so we have the Mishnah, which is the codified laws, and the Gemara, which is the commentary on the Mishnah. And then it's in 4 parts. And then the Halakha, which deals with the disputed legal questions. As time went on, the various highly venerated rabbis ruled on various issues that came up, and that embodies the halakha, and then the Haggadah, which is the illustrations and anecdotal examples of the application of the laws. But these four elements really constitute the Talmud. And there are two compilations of it: the Jerusalem Talmud from the 3rd to the 5th century, and the Babylonian Talmud from the 3rd to the 6th century. And between the two, the Babylonian Talmud is regarded as the more authoritative, and because the academies in Babylon survived the Palestinian academies by several centuries. And the era that follows this then is called the geonic era, geon being a sage or a highly venerated scholar. And there's a period then from this time through about the 12th century that is regarded as the geonic era. The halakha is the rabbinical interpretation, and they supplement the scriptures of the Torah. The Torah is highly venerated, and yet there's much that they observe that really is based on oral traditions rather than the writings that we would consider inspired writings of Moses and following. And so there's a tendency, as the history unfolds, for the Jews to venerate the rabbis even above the root texts. And the Haggadah is the illustrations and amplifications of all kinds of issues, ethical, political, as well as religious issues that are involved in the laws. And so from the 7th through the 11th century, you have a period that's alluded to as the geonic era, has its heroes and so forth. In this period, there's an interesting group of people that emerge from the 8th century on in Tsarist Russia. And they're called karaites, from the Hebrew verb kara, which means to read. These are people within the Jewish community that insisted upon staying strictly to the laws of Moses and the Torah. And they rejected the Talmud and the other rabbinical traditions that surrounded it. And during the first 6 centuries of AD, 6 centuries AD that had accumulated. What's interesting to me about this is that the karaites in Russia were exempted by the Tsar from the double taxation that the Jewish community had in general, and from the pogroms. As you may know, during the Tsarist era, there were repeated purgings and oppressions of the Jewish community. But that was, I didn't realize, we're focused on the Talmudic communities, not the karaites. And they were considered heretical by the Orthodox Jews, but exempted from the abuses that the Talmudic Jews were experiencing. And I find that very provocative. But anyway, as you get to the 12th and 13th century, this is where the Kabbalah, as it's commonly mentioned today, emerges. And the word Kabbalah actually simply means received tradition. And the word is used differently in different contexts. In the Talmud, that term occurs in two different senses. It occurs to refer to those portions of the scripture that are not Torah, the prophets and the hagiographa, in other words, the non-Torah passages. It's also used simply to indicate those things that are traditions and handed down by a teacher or by family traditions. So the term Kabbalah has a connotative use prior to the 11th and 12th century. But today, that term really focuses on the mystic and esoteric doctrines of Judaism. It's used in a different sense altogether. Generically, it's used of Jewish mysticism in all its forms, but specifically, when it's used denotatively, it refers to a very specific esoteric theosophy that crystallized in the 13th century, primarily in Spain and southern France. And its primary document is primarily best summarized, perhaps, by a book called the Book of Splendor, the Sefer HaZohar, or Zohar for short. It's generated primarily the main mystical movements in Judaism. You can wallow through many, there's just dozens of major books, written literature, that emerge impacting the Kabbalah. Here's a couple of the major ones. There's the Sefer Yetzirah, which is the book of creation. And what it focuses on is this whole idea of the 10 sefirot. The word sefirot is like emanations. And it's preoccupied with two things: the decimal system with the 10 sefirot, which I'll come to in a little bit, and it also makes a big thing of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet are provocative in many ways because they're not just phonetic letters like most alphabets. Each letter carries a idea or concept behind it. In fact, if you understand the concept behind each of the letters, most words in Hebrew are based on a 3-letter root. You can infer, if you know the alphabet properly, you can infer what the words mean. It's a very different kind of an alphabet. But the mystics, those that are steeped in the Kabbalah, believe that the letters actually have magical power, in effect. There's another document that becomes very pivotal in its history, and that's the Sefer HaBahir, which is the Book of Brightness. And this, among other things, starts to develop the idea that there's an equivalence between the history of Israel and the goings-on in the Godhead itself, especially between Israel and the Shekinah, which is always portrayed in mysticism as a feminine side of God. And it also, from this, develops then the whole notion that the obedience of Israel is a determining factor in establishing or reestablishing cosmic harmony, even to the inner life of the Godhead. So we start getting into some very bizarre interconnections here, from the behavior of Israel individually and collectively to the welfare, if you will, of what's going on in the inner life of the Godhead. So this mysticism is obviously far-reaching in its conjectures and so forth. But the dominant document of all these is the Sefer HaZohar. You'll hear everybody talking about the Zohar. It was penned over a 30-year period by Moses de Leon. He attributed it. In order to give it. He wrote many books, but to give his views here more weight, he attributed the Zohar to a legendary rabbi, a 2nd century rabbi, Shimon bar Yochai, and subsequent evidence has definitely established this de Leon as the author. But this document had far-reaching influence on Judaism for over 600 years. And it presents the Godhead as a dynamic flow of force, the unknowable Ein Sof, the highest concept here in the Zohar and in Kabbalistic mysticism is the Ein Sof. It's the unknowable, non-finite one. It actually is viewed as some kind of divine nothingness, out of which flow emanations in 10 forms. And the knowable attributes of the Godhead emanate in 10 sefirot, which are realms or planes. And this leads to mountains of literature speculating on how all these things interrelate. And Israel's history, including its life in exile, become symbols of the inner life of God. They start to see everything that's going on in Israel. Its expulsion from Spain in 1492 is a huge milestone. As the Spanish Kabbalah then gets distributed, as they left Spain, they reestablish themselves elsewhere. But there's a strange mystical parallelism between what's happening to Israel and what's really going on in the Godhead. And that starts to lead to the idea that Israel's behavior, the behavior of the faithful in Israel, are crucial to the destiny of the Godhead itself. So you get into some very strange inversions going on here. And now the emanations of this Ein Sof, forces of the divine essence, the tree of life is what it's sometimes called. And there's much speculation on what these various 10 elements really involve and how they interact. At the top of the heap is the Keter Elyon, the supreme crown. This is the identity, its identity, and the identity of Ein Sof, the unknowable deity, is sort of problematical because this is not Ein Sof. This is only part of it, and yet it's at the top of the heap. So there's some ambiguity of how you discern the difference between those two. But then you get to the Chokmah, which is the term for wisdom. This is the location of the primordial ideas of God. And the Binah, which is the intelligence, the organizing principle of the universe, is in the Binah. And these become, you see, the rubrics by which all this literature evolves over the centuries. And The fourth one is the Gedula, or greatness, or in some renderings of it, the Hesed, or love, the attribute of goodness in any case. And then we have the Gevura, which is the power, in some renderings, the din, or judgment. It's the attribute of the severity of God. So you've got love on the one hand and severity, and there's a tension, it would seem, between those two. And then you have the tension between is resolved with Tifereth, which is beauty, or in some renderings, compassion, as they reconcile the severity and the love and so forth. They deal with these terms. And the Tifereth is sort of the median principle between the previous two. And then you have the Nezach, which is lasting endurance, or a term for eternity, if you will. And the Hot, which is the majesty of God. And the Tzaddik, which is the righteous one, or Yesed Olam, and the others, the foundation of the world. It's the foundation of all the powers of God, presumably. This is all leading to God's manifestation, which is yet to be seen, coming down here, where we have the Malkut, which is the kingdom, or the diadem, or the presence, the kingship, sometimes also expressed as the Shekinah, the presence of God. And so these 10 elements then constitute the basic pillars of most of the literature of the Kabbalah, as they speculate on how these things interact and how they're in turn impacted by what's going on in the life of Israel and in the creation itself. In fact, they even have renderings of these things in terms of mankind, in terms of they reflect back that if God created man in his own image, then in some sense God is the image in the image of man. And so they reflect that back, and these issues then start to get very anthropomorphized in their dealings. So now the discipline of the Kabbalah, of course, includes all kinds of meditative practices that promise to enable individuals to share and participate in the nature of God's being. And this is where this gets very, very occultic. The Kabbalistic disciplines were recognized as being limited to a rarefied elite. Kabbalistic communities soon developed all around a particular leader or tzaddik, and who was, in many cases, regarded as one doing mysteries, doing magic by expressing various expressions from so the Kabbalah gets very, very occultic. By the time you get to the 16th century, so it started in the 11th, 12th, 13th, as you get to the 16th century, it takes a whole other turn through the leader of a guy by the name of Rabbi Isaac Luria, and you run into what's called Lurianic Kabbalah, which takes us a whole another distance here. Again, we're dealing with it. So far, it's been confined to a scholarly elite. The secret societies are organized around a tzaddik, which is in the Hebrew, or a rebbe in Yiddish. Rebbe is not really a rabbi; it's something much more special. But the 16th century, Rabbi Isaac Luria takes it in a whole other direction, and of course, by the 18th century, this whole thing becomes fundamental background to Eastern European rabbinic leadership. And so out of this will come in the 18th century, get the picture now, we're talking 6 centuries later after the Kabbalah has got its start, Hasidism. The word Hasid is simply a Hebrew term for a pious or a righteous person. Back in the 11th, 12th centuries, there was a community in the German side. We're not talking about Spain and southern France, but in German, the Hasidai Ashkenaz. They were German pietists. They were extreme. They had a very ascetic life, and they started to take a toehold, but quickly, about the 13th century, get eclipsed by the rise of the Jewish mysticism called the Kabbalah. And so, and we could talk about the various leaders that rise and back and forth, but the main teachings of the Kabbalah in this period is that, first of all, a heavy emphasis on the discovery of hidden codes in the Torah. And we'll show you some of those shortly. They make a big emphasis on pursuing the names of God. There are many different names of God in the Scripture, but they make a whole art form out of pursuing these, especially the 72-letter ultimate top one. It's actually not the ultimate one, because the ultimate one is regarded as the Torah itself, letter for letter, as a package. But the names of God, they ascribe to the expression of these names magical powers. There are healings and stories and anecdotes that feed those views. And of course, all this gets tied up with secrets involved with the Hebrew alphabet. You can go to Jewish bookstores and find books written of various mystical conjectures about each different letter and so forth. And of course, all this is built around the 10 sefirot, the 10 emanations that we reviewed, and Ein Sof being the unknowable infiniteness that's at the top. Critics of the Kabbalah will point out that part of the Ein Sof, the whole thing, is a thrust to depersonalize God and the mysteries of the inner life of God. You know, it's very interesting. If you study the book of Genesis, in Genesis chapter 9, there's this strange episode where Noah plants a vineyard, becomes drunk, and his sons take advantage of that. Now, in the text there is some overtones of perhaps homosexual abuses, but setting that aside, there is a basic crime envisioned from that event that echoes throughout the Scripture, and that's the crime of uncovering the father's nakedness. What's taught is that the father's dress shields his private nature, and to uncover that is to intrude inappropriately on him. So uncovering the father's nakedness is a crime, a sin that's widely acknowledged among the rabbis. What's fascinating, to stand back and recognize what's going on, that's exactly what they're doing or trying to do with the Kabbalah, with the 10 sefirot and all that. They're trying to get inside of the Godhead itself and speculate on its tensions. And their whole concept of, especially after the Lurianic twist in the Kabbalah, is that when the creation was done, there was a fumbling. They don't use that term, but there was sort of a gasp, a inhalation rather than exhalation, that resulted in some mistakes, and it's the sparks of the mistake are where evil comes from. And what's at risk now is to repair that failure in the creation by dealing with the evil. And as you get into those conjectures, Israel itself is part of the repair. And so it's incumbent upon the elite within Israel to adopt these Kabbalistic rituals in an attempt to assist in the tikkun, the repair of the universe. So the Kabbalah is not only just a fringe set of conjectures, it's actually almost inverting what we understand from the Scripture, that the Scripture teaches. That yes, there's a repair need to be done, but not by man. Man's not equipped to do that. But anyway, the Kabbalah emerges from the 12th to the 13th century. That's about where we are. In the 14th century, a major event occurs in Judaism, and that's the expelling of the Jews from Spain at 1492. They had to leave, and that's why Columbus and his gang, by midnight that night, had to leave port, because that was the deadline that was set up. And that causes the Kabbalists from Spain, of course, to be scattered and reestablished elsewhere. By the time you get to the 16th century, the Lurianic Kabbalah emerges, and that's a whole other twist on all of this, by Isaac ben Solomon Luria. And from his addition to the Kabbalistic perceptions is that a cosmic catastrophe occurred. The vessels of divine light shatter, sparks imprisoned in shards of evil, in effect. And it's the human task is the redemption, is nothing less than the redemption of the world and the reunification of the Godhead. You know, when we summarize it this way, it sounds like we're being, it's very audacious. But that's actually what they're dealing with. And this emergence of a human role to assist the Godhead, it also sparks the Sabbatian messianism. They had false messiahs start to surface. There's some very bizarre stories that emerge there, and then that all sets the stage for 18th century Polish Hasidism that most of us have encountered one way or another in New York or elsewhere. Van Luria, he founded this very influential school of Kabbalistic thought that has influenced all Kabbalism today. He was born in Jerusalem, raised in Egypt, and he became an adept at Jewish legal and mystical learning, of course. And but what comes on the following century is Shabbatai Zevi. Now this guy, this fascinates me. He was a Jewish false messiah. He proclaimed himself as a messiah. He was born in Smyrna. He was ordained as a sage, very brilliant young man. But by 1648, he demonstrated signs of manic depressive psychosis. He claimed to be the Messiah. He was expelled from Smyrna around 1651 or through 54. He wandered through Greece, Thrace, Palestine, and Egypt. He ends up getting imprisoned by the Turkish authorities. This is the Ottoman Empire day, you realize, in 1666. He converts to Islam and dies in exile. So you would think he was totally discredited. No, because you have to understand they take all these elements and create symbols out of them, and the events of his life then are Kabbalistically interpreted, and a whole movement around him continues for several centuries. And so you stand back, it's strange that you would think that these false messiahs it would be over. But that underestimates the ability of them to rationalize these things in terms of symbols that they apply to their conjectures of the Kabbalah. And so, anyway, out of this we have Hasidism, which carries with it, among other things, a strong messianic overtone. They look for false messiahs that are part of their image. And so understand that the Hasidism really emerges out of the 18th century, many centuries after the Kabbalah got solidified. Now, the Hasidic teachings obviously emphasize maintaining the old traditions. They consciously preserve the lifestyles of Eastern European ancestors and so forth. And although each community has its own theology, its own traditions, its own practices, including a distinctive style of dress for the men and the women and so forth, they resist modern ideas and lifestyles, and strictly as they possibly can interpret the halakha, the Jewish oral traditions and so forth. They usually maintain the Yiddish language, a strange mix of Hebrew and German and Polish. It's the common language of the Eastern European Jews, and it's used in their daily life. Another big emphasis, of course, is maintaining God's experiencing God's presence, and everything they do in their life attempts to emphasize God operating in their lives, and they, despite everything that challenges that rivals that, would in terms of suffering, physical desire, psychological distractions are considered just that, distractions to their commitment to experience God's presence. And they believe that cultivating an awareness of God's presence in this material world gives them an insight into the unfolding of God's inner life. There's a strange relationship between what's going on in the Godhead and what's going on in this world tangibly. And so every act of their daily life is perceived in terms of being connected, or at least an opportunity to be connected to the inner life of God, the Word of God. And so that's, and of course, buried all this is waiting for a Messiah. And like most forms of Judaism from the Second Temple on, there was ultimately the Hasidics recognized that this is all to be redeemed by a Messiah and a descendant of King David. They embrace that, and so they believe that leadership would the Messiah will come and rebuild the temple. They have they have a big focus on that, and so their recent history too is looking at an expectation of the Lubavitches and so forth. And even when Schneerson died, they still think he may come and so forth. They have these strange commitments. Now, there's the movement known as Hasidism today really owes its popularity to a popularization by the Baal Shem Tov. And he had the goal to spread the essence of Kabbalistic learning from the scholarly elite to the poor and barely literate. And so it was an attempt to popularize that which had been held very close. And so he's considered the founder of Hasidism. Israel ben Eliezer, called Baal Shem Tov, the master of the divine name. There again, he was accredited as having skill at really using the names of God in doing what you and I would call magic. And his name, the Baal Shem Tov, is sometimes abbreviated the besht, but he is a subject of legends himself. And so he really, his disciples, and I won't go through all of these, but it was his disciples that, with their zeal and emphasis, popularized Hasidism throughout Eastern Europe. And they in turn had missionaries in the Ukraine and elsewhere. And even Schneerson was the seventh descent from him. So the Hasidism has its spread. But Hasidism is opposed then. It became very controversial. The 1770s, 18th century. Rabbi Elijah ben Solomon of Vilna. He's called you'll see Vilna Gaon. That's a title, really. Vilna is where he's from, and Gaon is a top sage, a scholar. They banned Hasidism as a heretical movement. And but the Holocaust, of course, finally rolls in here in World War II, which devastated European Jewry in general and the Hasidics in particular. It scattered the remnants of these guys throughout the world. They created new centers. They add up to about 300,000 worldwide, the true Hasidics. And so that gives us a quick snapshot. One of the things that they embrace, and interestingly enough, I'm finding some evidence that this was actually an adaptation of hermeneutics advocated by the early Christian community. But they see four levels of interpretation in all these things. The besht is what they call the literal. When we see something in the scripture, it's the literal. It really happened that way. That's the besht, the primary direct denotative interpretation. Behind that, though, is the remez, the allegorical application. That is, one of the reasons it's there is because there's meaning that is symbolic. And there's also the darash. In fact, logically, to put the darash before this, but there's a reason they put it in this order. The darash is the homiletical, the practical application of these stories. And then, of course, there's the fourth level, which is the mystical, mysterious side. And so these four, everything in the Torah is regarded as having at least these four levels of meaning. And, of course, the first three are somewhat determinative. But the fourth is again, really moved out in the field of conjecture. But these four letters, the PRDS, Pardes, is the word for garden. It also stands for paradise. But that's the way they remember as a mnemonic for these four levels of meaning. But as you get into literature, the reason it can go so far afield from the direct literal interpretation is because they're leaning so heavily on what they call the sod, or the mystical measurement. And this is all developed by Moses de Leon, this whole concept here that's so prevalent in rabbinical Judaism of all kinds. Interesting enough, tracks back to de Leon, the same guy that did the Zohar. But there is evidence by some of the scholars that this really was an adaptation of the four levels of meaning used by the early expositors in the Christian community. It's the sod level that gives you no limit to the degree of conjectures you can reach out to. For example, in Deuteronomy 3, Moses has a prayer. This is explained by the rabbis in over 232 different ways. It reminds me, in a sense, of something that we have said in the computer industry for many years, and that is, if you torture the data long enough, it'll confess to anything. And that's pretty much, this is an example of most prayer. The Zohar stresses the symbolic importance, many times taking very insignificant little surface details and making a whole thing out of it. In Genesis 36, there's a short list of the kings of Edom, and they make a whole career out of that one. The deeds of Benaiah in 2 Samuel 23 are examples where in the Zohar, they'll go on for pages and pages and pages of explaining the profound significance of these would seem trivial details. But a special emphasis all the way through the Kabbalah is the alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet, and numerical mysticisms. And we'll talk a little bit about in the next session. One of the things they extol very highly is the role of the Torah. And you say, yeah, it's good, they really venerate the text, except they really see it all in terms of just symbols, symbolic character of all earthly phenomena. And they search for the hidden inner reality at all levels, and that moves right into the field of conjectures. And they have three primary principles. The Torah is considered the mystical name of God. The Torah, the whole Torah is itself, 78,000 letters. And the Torah is looked at as a living organism. And they feel there's you get to this view that not only did God create the universe, the Torah is the means by which he did it. By the expression of the Torah, they try to link the Torah literally to the universe itself. So that's a quick, obviously superficial historical summary of the Kabbalah, but what it lays against a fabric of Judaism as it redefines itself, having rejected its Messiah in the first century. And with the temple destroyed, and as they grope for a whole different basis of significance, moving to a life of commitment to good works, incredible sincerity, incredible commitment, but laced with increasingly far afield conjectures. I see this as a tether. They're not linked to the text. That tether keeps getting longer and longer and longer as they venerate rabbis of different kinds and indulge in attempts to understand the nature of God himself, the internal workings of the Godhead, ascribing to that Godhead a fumbling that created evil, and that it is in need of cosmic harmony being reestablished. And it's the role of man, specifically Israel, to participate and bring about the tikkun, the redemption of not just the physical world, not just the redemption of man, but the reestablishment of harmony within the Godhead. And you talk about uncovering the Father's nakedness. That's the best way to summarize this whole escapade of the Kabbalah in the sense of it being taken seriously. Now, there is obviously a substantial gap between the true Kabbalah and some of these forms of popular Kabbalah, which are exploitations by promoters and what have you. But still, it's very easy for many of us as we discover, in some respects, an indebtedness to the Kabbalists for discovering aspects of the Hebrew text that are very edifying. They have made some fascinating discoveries of the Hebrew text that can serve to authenticate the text as being supernatural, to give honor and glory to its author on the one hand, but they take this in a direction that is blasphemous, really. And we'll take a look at some of the good news and some of the bad news in the Kabbalah in the next session.